So Melissa, would you like to call us to order?
Sure. Yeah, let's call the meeting to order at 6:05. We can do roll call. Robert Bonner and Gabriel. Then there was Leslie.
Yep.
And me. I think that's it. Looks like the others are not here yet.
They may arrive. And tonight we have Elizabeth Decker with us and Heather Austin. So two of our consultants from the last meeting. Steve had a conflict and had another meeting to be at the same time. So we don't have any minutes to approve tonight because we didn't get them done.
There was a lot.
Yeah. So what we wanted to do is continue on with the discussion where we were at 2 weeks ago. And so Elizabeth has put together a PowerPoint and she's going to walk us through that information.
Yeah, great. I mean, everyone's favorite words. Elizabeth has put together a PowerPoint. PowerPoint on Zoom. Like, does it get more 2020 than that? Yes, so this evening we put together a PowerPoint. It's got a lot more pictures, I promise you. So hopefully that is useful. And we really wanted to start off, next slide if you would please. Give you an overview. What we're hoping to do, diving back into and picking up the discussion about the code audit and code concepts is, apologies. We sort of wanted to hit the ground running last time, and I thought maybe we might back up a little bit and talk a little bit more using some visual images about more about like what the middle housing is that we're going to see and what the feasibility of some of these development scenarios are, so that that'll help inform as we talk through these different concepts and different housing types, give us all more of a sense of what we're actually planning for, rather than a lot of vague hypotheticals. Now, granted, there's still a lot of hypotheticals that we are not gonna know until 20 years down the line, but I wanted to give you a best shot on that. Talk more explicitly about parking and what's the same and different across different housing types, and then spend more time in depth talking about cottage clusters and master plan communities that we didn't have as much time to talk about last time. And then make sure that we hear from you about your interest areas and if there's any other parts of the code or about middle housing or development regulations that we haven't highlighted so far. And then Heather is going to help us talk through our next step, which is going to be a public open house. And then if we have anybody from the public, we have some time for public comments. Next, please. Oh, and I think I was supposed to let Heather even tell us about that agenda, but
you're doing great. Keep going.
We agree. This is a good sign. All right. So again, just in terms of grounding us and maybe helping us focus our discussion, we wanted to come back to what is this future world that we're planning for? So again, we're trying to focus in on duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters, tongue twister for 2021. And that's the range of housing types. And then within those, there could be options for both new construction types of any of those, or additions to or conversions of existing buildings, particularly if we start to think about allowing some of those detached configurations of some of the plexes. You could see where someone could add another structure onto their existing lot, and wind up with 2 or 3 or 4 units that way. So there are ways to use existing sites and existing buildings, or just build the entire lot from scratch. And along with that comes the opportunity for some of these to be sited in existing neighborhoods, either through those conversions or through, purchasing a lot, demoing it, and building new construction, lot by lot, or in new neighborhoods where these housing types might be planned more strategically, possibly concentrated, townhouses over on this street and single family detached over here, and duplexes on every third corner. But there's opportunities for these to be located in across the city. Next, please. So with that, we wanted to take you on a bit of a tour this evening to get a sense of what these new housing types might look like, based on some of the first ones that we're seeing built and how they might differ from historical examples. So, this is not going to be your grandma's duplex. They're just, they're not building houses like they used to. And all the same trends that we've seen affect single family detached construction over the years are likely to affect what we're going to see for middle housing as well. So when we're looking through these slides, I'm hoping we can just sort of have a visual tour here, and then hold our discussion and observations more for the end. Although of course, happy to go back to any individual images. But maybe we can, if you could keep in mind sort of thinking about what emerges for you as some of the challenging design issues, looking at these different types when you think both, and I think challenging design issues comes from the perspective of the building itself. So is it feasible to build this triplex or this townhouse here? And what are some design challenges that might limit the actual ability to get these housing types built? And then on the flip side, sort of not from the perspective of everyone around these housing types, what are some of the challenges that might exist in terms of how these housing types get integrated into surrounding neighborhoods? So again, keeping in mind, some of these are going to be more of an infill scenario where most blocks are already pretty heterogeneous and have a pretty good mix of different housing types. And then there's also going to be opportunities in newer neighborhoods where things are going to be a little bit more similar. So the perspective both on the lot and surrounding the lot. So next, please. So again, I just love this picture. Just as a reminder, our duplexes and our middle housing hasn't been built for the last, 50, 75 years. And so the old duplex on your right here is not really the same architectural style or massing or some of the other design features as some of the newer duplexes that you might see, such as this one on your left. Next. Okay, here's a corner duplex example. You can see, there's a lot of the similar construction trends that you're seeing in new construction, just in terms of materials choices, roof slopes, a little bit different, but here's how they were able to take advantage of the corner. Next, please. Here's another corner duplex, although actually one thing that'll hopefully emerge in these slides is that it can be, there's definitely a blurring of the lines between these types, whether this is, truly a corner duplex or whether it's two townhouses that are on a corner. But you can see that some of these, the massing gets to be pretty high. So that's something that we should consider. Next. Here we talked about these detached plex options, and here's an example of what a detached duplex might look like. It's just really two smaller homes that are situated on the same lot, but that's what it could look like. Next. And here's another newer example. You can see they've added, a different architectural style, and just pointing out as we look through this and others, like, where's the driveway? In this example, you really are able to see more of the front yard and the duplex itself because the driveway is tucked behind, and there's access to the garage that way. Next. Other cases, there can be a balancing of getting those driveways and those garages onto the front, but I'd say this one is fairly successful, I think, in terms of still having a presence on the street and main entrances and connections. Next. Here's a different duplex. You can see they took a different architectural approach so that they look more separate rather than a single structure that just happens to be carved up into two units. Next. And then, potentially you could have a scenario like this where you see a row of duplexes all built, similar time. You can see they've made a few different detailing choices here, but pretty similar massing, kind of creates a street aesthetic. Next. Here's an example, as we move up in the numbers of a triplex on a corner. Again, this one actually, I think, as we go to the next slide, might actually be townhouses rather than a triplex, but same idea. It's about three attached units on a single lot. This was built by an affordable housing developer here in Portland. And you'll notice that the cars are parking on the street, and if you can almost peek behind, but they did not include a rear driveway or garages on this in order to maximize those 3 units and get them to fit on the corner lot. Next. Here's a different approach to a triplex. I think this particular lot was kind of a funny triangle shape, which is why they used this staggered setback for the 3 units, but it's an interesting approach to articulation. And they were able to, on this site, they had access to parking in the back. So they do have what looks like double car garages, but also has, front porches and direct connection to the sidewalk. Next. Looking, again, just adding more units, we get up to a quadplex here. This one's got 4 fairly well articulated entrances. Next. This is a quadplex infill example in an older residential neighborhood. Likewise, does not have off-street parking. All the parking is on-street in order to fit the 4 units on a corner lot, but they each have individual entrances and connections to the street. And presumably was able to be sited on the same space that a single home used to occupy. Next. And then there's also opportunities for these quadplexes in a new neighborhood. This one is from South Hillsborough. Lennar Homes is building this one. So this is, I just found it fascinating to find an example of a new quadplex being, marketed. So here's one that they've come up with. Next. And then we move into the townhouses and, getting a sense of the range of those. So again, there's this blurring of the lines between the different housing types. And so you can see how, do we call this a duplex? Is it a 2-unit townhouse? In terms of massing and impacts and, visual design concepts, parking issues, really the only thing that's different is the invisible lot line, or, maybe it's visible with these lovely shrubberies here, but that's really the main difference between some of these projects is lot lines that we can't necessarily see with our naked eye. So there's more in common than not in common for us to think about from a regulatory perspective. Next. 3-unit, more, shall we say more urban setting. Next. Here's a 6-unit townhouse project. Again, I think they had 2 lots on a corner that they were able to combine to take advantage for these 6 units. And then next, we can see the site plan. And so they were able to put in a driveway that loops through the back of this site and provides access to parking. And they were able to also, take advantage of the corner and orient some of the units towards both of the different sides. So, it has some presence and sort of breaks up the massing that way. The next. Here's a 5-unit townhouse project. And this one was able to get parking from the rear. So is able to just have that presence on the street. Next. And then sometimes we see projects where they're taking direct access from the street, which just creates these impacts in terms of the driveways and the garages. So thinking about the interplay between, the doorway and entrance prominence relative to the garage, and then how that impacts the street. This particular example doesn't look like it even has a sidewalk. So there's not a lot of great pedestrian opportunities here. And even if there were a sidewalk, it would get pretty broken up by those repetitive driveways. So something to think about as we're contemplating access options for townhouses. Next, great. And then we get into the cottage clusters that we're hoping to talk more about tonight in detail. And so to give you a sense of some of the structures that have been built, there's often, I think these are some pretty charming examples. And next one, they have a lot of good details. They're pretty well scaled. They're just smaller. I will say that, truth in well, I don't know. Is this truth in advertising, or am I telling you what's hidden behind the images? These types of cottages have been the few examples that have come forward, but many of them are, they're less affordable than many would hope. And so I think that one of the big questions going forward with cottage development is, will we see some changes to the architectural styles being used on cottages in order to appeal to a broader price point and deliver some of the promise of cottage housing? It'll be interesting just to see how it changes, because most of the projects to date have been higher end. Next. And then in addition to how the individual units look, the real key to these cottage units is their layout. So here's an example from Florence on the coast, where they've got the 12 units, and this is just textbook classic example, 12 units all clustered around the shared lawn and garden space in the center. So they're all oriented to that. And then the parking is, removed in these shared parking bays that aren't directly adjacent to the sites. So, that has some aesthetic benefits, but you can also imagine if it's raining outside like it is right now, or you've got a kid and you've got 3 bags of groceries and you're trying to, get from the parking lot back to your cottage at the far end of the lawn. That may or may not seem like an appealing option to some consumers. So we've also seen some builders experimenting next with some alternative layouts. So this was an example that was shared at the recent LCDC hearing, showing how with some flexibility around the courtyard orientation. So instead of making every unit face that common lawn, if there's some flexibility, all these units still have access to green space, but they are able to have a lot closer proximity to some of the parking areas. And so, for one, it allowed more units to fit onto this site. And it also allowed, what some would say would be amenities for future residents to make it a little more livable. So definitely some trade-offs there. And then another example. Oh, on the next, yeah, thank you. So this one sort of takes it even further and kind of flips some of the houses. So what you're seeing in these pictures is the garage side, right, which is oriented towards the white alleyways, and then the fronts of the homes are oriented towards the green spaces in the center. But they're a little less, clustery and a little bit more linear, if those are technical terms. So this one and the one that I just showed previously really couldn't be built under the model, the state's model code. And so that's where our questions really come in as we start talking about this and drilling into it, about thinking about how much flexibility we want to put into the cottage cluster standards to allow some alternative layouts and potentially some greater flexibility, potentially bringing price points down or making it more feasible to actually get some of these projects built. So some issues to consider. Next. All right, so some takeaways that I noticed is that we see really a range of architectural styles, some that mirror just broader industry trends for residential development, some that are probably suited to individual subdivisions or individual city preferences, not the city as a regulatory entity, but just in terms of regional preferences. That the scale of the units in the buildings definitely in some of these examples can get pretty large. So thinking about how that scales and makes sense in various situations. And that we see a real range of differences of how parking gets treated and how, when parking is included, it often has some impacts on the site design and the relationship to the street. And so some trade-offs in terms of both how convenient it is for future residents, how it impacts neighborhoods, and how it impacts the feasibility of getting the housing built in the first place. And then the last part, just sort of my joke about, it turns out I don't have my X-ray goggles when we look at these things. And so it's hard to tell what kind of units these are, that there's this real sort of blurring and that there's a lot more similarities across these units than differences. And I apologize, there's a little formatting issue here, but what you're not seeing is the bullet point where it says group thoughts, ? So that's when, back one more if you would, please. Other way. There we go. So now I just thought we'd take a pause and sort of go around the group and hear your initial impressions from the tour and any questions, knowing that we are going to get into some more specific detail about cottages here in a minute. So you can share those thoughts or hold them, but you'll have another opportunity.
I find myself thinking in terms of like, well, is this going to be a rental or is this going to be something that's sold for, for ownership? Because I can't, what it looks like, I guess, is, like you said, you don't know from the outside necessarily what it's going to be, but those price points and who you're serving are definitely a lot different. And some of those homes that were either the duplexes or, a zero lot line townhome ownership, whatever it might have been, they were really nice. And those are going to be a super high price point. So on one hand, it's like, we need more housing. So more housing is good. But we need more affordable housing here. I mean, like everywhere in Oregon, I guess, but still I don't think we can necessarily thoroughly balance the market or something, but that's just sort of a constant thought process that I am going through when I see some of these homes. And maybe that what we see and think of as infill might not end up being, it's not going to be some kind of salvation to supply affordable housing for Newburgh, but I think you're going to talk about like some of the other larger pieces of land that are master planned, that in those types of areas, it might have more of an impact for affordable housing in terms of volume.
Yeah, wow, so many great points that you bring up. So first of all, yes, you make a great point that a lot of these images are of probably higher end products. And so they don't necessarily help directly with that affordability question. And, part of that is just a function of like what projects people choose to photograph and put on the internet, right? When you're looking for pictures of duplexes, there's not a lot of people trumpeting like, look at this great affordable duplex I built. So I can do some more work on that to keep working. So that's to find some more pictures of things that might be a little bit more affordable and more realistic, particularly as we get into the open house. I am no economist, but I think one thing that we've heard repeatedly with regards to this middle housing is that newer housing is always more expensive. And so in some ways, middle housing, could help on the edges, particularly maybe in some of these, higher numbers of units and other in some of the newly built areas. But the other way that it can help is just by adding, more units to the inventory and bringing down, competition for existing units is part of the hope. You'd have to ask an economist if it's really going to work out, but I've heard it described as a game of musical chairs, because right now there's just not enough chairs. And so always the rich people win. And if we can add more chairs, even if they're fancy chairs, there will be more chairs to go around. I don't know if that's going to work or not. Don't quote me on it. I'm just here to write zoning code. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of interesting economic questions. And then the last piece that I would just say in response that I think is so interesting is, a lot of these 2-unit projects that we're seeing, one, are like fairly large scale and are also, fairly high price points. And I'm curious to see once we start allowing more units, if that means people will still stick with, building the two that they think they can make more money with, or if they think that, like, hey, if I'm going to build this same size dwelling, maybe I can cut it up into 4 units now instead of just 2. And to me, that would be a win, right? Because even if you're going to get a large building, at least you're getting 4 units instead of 2 units out of it. So I think that'll be interesting. But other group thoughts?
I guess I keep thinking I don't know very much about middle housing and housing code. And so I find myself wondering, like, well, what's the downside? What are we not hearing? Why not? Why not give developers and homeowners as many options as possible? Like, I think with families looking for more creative ways, I could see a family maybe even adding on to their home to make a duplex so their parents can live with them, or like, I think the more flexibility the better, but I feel like I'm also trying to look behind the curtain with why not? Why wouldn't we give people so many options?
Mhm. Yeah, I think some of the concerns about that, which may or may not be shared by this group, but is that you can get some pretty large scale buildings. So there's some concern about that. And then there's also some concern about, I think parking is probably the biggest one, that if you just let it be really flexible, that the impacts of parking can be externalized. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in detail, but I think that those are some of the commonly cited concerns about giving utter flexibility in regulating, well, in not regulating these housing types. Other thoughts before we start talking, before we move on?
Well, I guess I have maybe 2 more zoning type questions, which was, what are some of the challenges to implement some of these housing types? Like, I don't really know what our setbacks are. So would there be changes proposed to allow more of these housing types? And the other one that does cross my mind, I guess this is not a zoning question. I thought I had another one. It was more about, I guess I was just thinking about parking, but it crosses my mind, like the more of these smaller units to get, the more likelihood theoretically of having more like Airbnb, short-term rental type properties. And I can think of, I don't know, like 3 or 4 just in my neighborhood, like and I haven't kept up on what the city's been doing with in terms of that. I know it was on the long list of to work on items, so.
Yeah, I guess just to the first point in terms of challenges, that we've detailed a lot of them in the code concepts and code audit memo. The idea being there, just as you're saying, like, let's find the barriers with, the existing setbacks or lot coverage standards or other zoning standards that could limit the development of these types. I'm seeing a comment from Irma here that she wanted to add something. Not seeing her. Doug, can you let me know?
I can't promote Irma while I'm screen sharing. So Doug, if you can go into the panelist side, she's probably an attendee. She probably came in as an attendee. And if you could just right click on her thing, there'll be a button that says more, and you want to select promote to a panelist, because otherwise she can't talk.
On to say that again. So I went to more.
So if you click on more, there should be some drop down options.
Yeah.
And one of those should be promote to panelist.
Nope, I don't have that.
Okay, I'm going to stop the screen real quick and then bring her over. Okay, Irma should be on now.
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. My first question, I think Elizabeth already answered about if it was we're talking about selling or we're talking about renting, and then about the units that you guys were talking about. It when you're talking about units, in those units, how many rooms are those units gonna have?
Yeah, so I guess the short answer to both those questions is it depends. And it's going to be very according to the individual projects. We are hoping to create opportunities both for units that can be sold and owned and those that can be rentals. So some of the housing types are more conducive to that than others. So townhouses, right, generally make better ownership products. And some of the, if you had a quadplex, for example, the 4 units on a single lot, it's quite likely that those would get rented out. There is an option to do like a condo and sell the individual units as condos, but there's a lot of, like, condos are complicated and there's a lot of reasons that developers don't like to do them. I understand from other people that that's a less appealing option. And then the bedroom counts are really going to depend on, the units and who the builders are marketing towards. And again, like if you have a quadplex, you're probably more likely to have 1 or 2 bedrooms than if you have a duplex. You probably have room to, have more bedrooms than that, larger scale units. So we really just sort of depend on the site and the project.
And when we say affordable houses, let's talk about a townhouse that right now in the marketing, you're talking about $200,000 to 10. And if we're saying here that we're talking about affordable houses, the price is gonna be around the same range, or is gonna go less than that?
Yeah, thank you. That is such a good point. And I wish that I had more explicitly addressed it, but you gave me the perfect opportunity. Middle housing, we do talk about affordable housing, but I don't think that it's a straight line. We, through zoning alone, don't have a lot of power. The city doesn't have a lot of power to directly impact the prices of the resulting homes. So I don't know that we have a lot of forecasts about how much these homes are going to cost. The idea, generally is that if you make them smaller and you make the lot sizes smaller, you're creating, a lot of ways to reduce the costs. But it isn't necessarily a straight line, in part because new construction is still going to be expensive to actually get built and developed. So we really will just have to wait and see, honestly, to get a better sense of what the prices will be like.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for the good questions. All right, well, we're going to keep talking about these issues, so keep all these images in your mind. Next image, or next slide, if you would, please. Now is the time. Did everyone please pull out your government-issued crystal ball that hopefully is in good working order, just like mine. It's a little cloudy, in fact, but we are hoping to just sort of think through a little bit about when, where, and how many of these new housing types we're likely to see, which just to help us have a sense of what the magnitude of the impacts might be as we are developing zoning standards for this. So next slide, please. So big caveat, I know that Newburgh is not Portland and is not part of Metro, but when we look around for a case study about, what could happen with middle housing, I think a really compelling story that has a lot of interesting parallels is looking at accessory dwelling units in the city of Portland. So you may think of Portland, a lot of people, it's gotten this reputation as a city with a ton of ADUs, the ADU capital of America. And so you can see in this graph the last 18 years of permitting history that was not actually always the case. Even in a large city, they were only seeing permits, in the 20s, about 20 some per year for most of the 2000s. And it was not really until 2010 that I started picking up. And then the last couple years have really hit like 600 units a year, which really, is astonishing and helped, earn that reputation. But what's not shown behind these numbers, the rough story is that the city, opened the door by allowing these with zoning code regulations even before 2000. They made some, incremental revisions to the zoning code reforms through the 2000s. And then it was really not until, there was much greater consumer awareness, homeowner awareness, changes in the market, and a powerful financial incentive from the city by waiving the system development charges that reduced the price of these by about 5 to 10% for homeowners to develop. And that's really when you start to see this cumulative impact. So a takeaway here is we're on the we're way on the left, right, in Newburgh and everywhere in the state in terms of middle housing. So what we're likely to see is very low numbers of permits for these new housing types for, as we initially embrace these housing types. So what we're trying to do is just that same first step with this project of opening the door, making these permissible to do, and then we will continue as a city and as a state to look for other financial, educational, and other incentives that are going to, help these projects take off in areas where they make sense, right? And where there is interest and demand in them. But, right now we're way out on the left. So next. And what we're also is likely to see is uneven distribution of where these middle housing types land. So, never mind the different colors of dots here. I think that the concentration of dots is more interesting. So if you're familiar with Portland, the inner east side is a little flatter and has, more traditional 5,000 square foot lots, single family residences. And that's where you see most of the ADUs clustered. And so likewise, there are some, whatever the pattern is going to be in Newburgh, there will probably be neighborhoods that are more conducive to infill development and newer neighborhoods that might be more conducive to larger new development projects of middle housing. But it's likely not to be distributed, one per block in some sort of even spacing. There'll be areas where it's clustered more than others. And next. So some lessons that we see from this, again, like it's the incremental zoning reforms accompanied by financial policies that seem to make the difference for ADUs. And, we don't know if that's gonna be the same story for middle housing or not. But nevertheless, we're probably looking at pretty slow growth in permits over the next 20 years. And that, even in a place like Portland, let alone other cities in the metro area that I've worked with on ADU permits where their cumulative permits are still in the, less than 50, let's say, less than 30 in many cases. But, even a place where it seems like they're giving out ADU permits, over the counter, they are still, the overall impact is that ADUs only total about 1% of the total dwelling units in Portland. So that's still a pretty small percentage. And we'd expect, it makes sense. They're just catching up to hundreds of, 100 years of development. So likewise in Newburgh, we probably wouldn't expect these middle housing types to take over the market overnight. So next, please. And again, I'm not an economist. This graph, however, was prepared by economists. So this is some materials that Eco Northwest put together as part of their feasibility analysis to help the state understand how to write zoning regulations for middle housing that best supports options that will be developmentally feasible in terms of providing a rate of return that make a project profitable to build rather than losing money on it. So they were testing a variety of different things, but the main thing that I wanted to call your attention to with these graphs is just to show that there's only a few scenarios that they tested. What you're looking for here is they used the cool market, the medium market, or no, cool, warm, and hot, red being hot and blue being cool, to test various development scenarios. And so what you're looking for is the corresponding dots to be above the corresponding dotted lines. So there's only a few cases here. In none of the cool markets, triplexes are not feasible under any scenarios, is what this says. You know, sure, there might be a one-off where somebody has a lot and personally wants to develop, but it's not going to make market sense to develop triplexes in any of those markets. I'm guessing Newburgh's going to be a warm or a hot market, although they're pretty vague definitions. But even then you can see the orange dots almost never get above the orange line, and the red triangles only get above the red line in very hot markets and under limited circumstances. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see how many triplexes actually get built, you know, given this limited financial outlook. Next. Luckily, things look, things look a little bit better when we get over to the quadplex side. Oh, yeah, so here you see, even in the warm markets, you see those orange dots getting over the dotted orange lines and the red triangles getting over the dotted red line. So there's a lot more scenarios where quadplexes start to look feasible. So that, you know, just gives us some ideas of what types of development we might see. Next. And so, you know, just again, like we have very cloudy crystal balls, but a few things that we're seeing in the state of Oregon, you know, the best minds got together and said, well, what's a reasonable estimate? And this number was developed for a different purpose than, you know, telling you how many housing units are going to happen. But nevertheless, I think it's interesting that they're saying, you know, they're not expecting more than 3% of new homes or of total housing stock to be made up of middle housing development within, you know, cities' existing urban growth boundaries as we go forward. So, you know, if you think about ADUs being 1%, you know, 3%, yeah, that does seem like, you know, it would take a lot of development to get to 3%. So they're not, you know, the state economists and the housing planners are not anticipating it to be much above that, except in, you know, special cases where you can document that there's been just off the charts production. And, you know, again, we're on the far left side of that graph. Minneapolis is also there. They just passed some reforms, if you've been following, that allow triplexes on every lot with single family detached. And they've seen a whopping total of 3 new permits in the first year of zoning code implementation. So, you know, we really are just, next slide, if you would, please. We really are just at the beginning of this. And, you know, it'll be interesting to see how these housing units get built over time. But, you know, I think there's sort of the unfortunate conclusion of, gosh, we're going to do all this work and nothing's going to get built. But I think that the positive way to look at it is to say there's still going to be a lot of room for innovation and for considering what happens. And we, you know, are going to make our best effort now, and then we will see some of the projects that move forward. But we really won't have to, you know, I don't think that we need to worry about, you know, an overwhelming onslaught of new projects as soon as the code gets in place. Okay, so next. And then also wanted to think about making sure we understand the relative role of zoning code compared to other aspects and forces that impact development feasibility. So zoning code is really more like your favorite X-Men character than it is like Superman, right? Zoning code really can't, you know, scale tall buildings and fly around the world and, you know, travel to planet Krypton and whatnot by itself. So you really need all of your team members. So building codes, SDCs, public improvement requirements, land availability that's influenced by the UGB and other private landowners' willingness, and then factors completely outside the city control, like access to financing, consumer preferences, and again, willing sellers, willing buyers. So, our zoning code update is a very important first step, but it is not the only step that's going to make these projects actually take off and get built. So we want to focus on what we can do, knowing that there are some additional pieces that will need to come into play later on. Next. So our goal really, again, like we're at the start, and we want to do our best and set the tone for these middle housing types. When we're writing code, I think it's important to remember we don't have to predict the winning designs. Zoning code is not about designing projects for developers and saying, oh, you do everything according to this and follow all these details, like that'll be the perfect project. Code is not really a designing or creative force, right? Zoning code is really more about setting some minimums for regulatory purposes and making sure that all development complies with what we think are priorities. But there is a lot of flexibility in terms of what winds up getting built. And then with these particular zoning code updates that we're doing, because of the state's role in middle housing, we need to make sure that we meet their minimums. And the way that the state code has really been written, I like to think of it as a buffet of different housing options. We can choose some items from the buffet, but we can't necessarily order something else off the menu. So that particularly comes up like with some of the design standards, where they've said, here are 5 things you can regulate with the design standards. You can pick none, you can pick all 5, you can pick 1 or 2, but you can't necessarily add 20 more to your plate. So we really get to choose among some available options. Next. Which brings us to, speaking of options, thinking about, well, I guess I should pause for a second. Any questions about the role of zoning and forecasting before we get into the always fun topic of parking? Okay, well, we'll have more opportunities if something comes to you. But let us address parking more head on, because we heard a lot of questions about that in our previous meeting. And there is a lot of similarity across the different housing types. And so we thought it would be useful to address some of this head on. So across the board for all the different housing types that we're talking about, the state requirements say that the minimum off-street parking requirements cannot be greater than 1 space per unit for all these housing types. And, further than that, the best practices and some of that development feasibility suggests that having no minimum parking actually better supports the creation of housing types and greater affordability. So the city has the option, to set it at the 1 or bring it down lower. Next. And also to differentiate among the different housing types, right? And when we consider how we write parking regulations, back to sort of thinking about the role of zoning code. The zoning code is not saying this parking is the right number for every site. There could still be sites that exceed the minimums because that's what makes sense for what the builder's doing or the market that the type of consumer that they're aiming at. But it's a regulatory minimum where the city says we have an interest in making sure that at least this many spaces are provided. But there's still some flexibility about what actually gets built, right? You've probably not seen any single family homes developed without parking recently. And that's not necessarily a function of the zoning code. It's more about what developers are trying to sell to. And we're seeing that some research, from around the state shows that some lower parking minimums are able to, better support housing development, reduced energy demands, and greater affordability. So, bringing it down to 1 is a great first step there. And thinking about whether it goes any lower is something else we can discuss. Next. And then just thinking about how parking needs might change over time. Just like my crystal ball is cloudy, my time machine is just on the fritz right now. So it's not working so great. But parking needs might change in the future. What's built today is going to be serving, as part of neighborhoods in the next 50 years. And those parking needs may change. I don't want to say that we're going to have jetpacks or hover cars or anything really cool like that. There probably will still be a need for some parking, right? But those needs might be different. And in the near term, just because the needs might change in 50 years, there still could be some conflicts tomorrow, if these housing types do start to get built in larger numbers. So there could be some on-street parking issues. And the state also has some tools, and some other, communities have experimented with on-street parking management tools, which I'm now looking at this slide. I do not mean to imply that parking meters are the answer. I was just trying to make a joke about time changing here. So there are other on-street parking management tools like parking districts and other tools that are more appropriate for residential neighborhoods. If there are particular pockets where on-street parking gets tight, there are ways to manage that. Okay, next. So here's just, I thought we'd take a chance or take our opportunity here to get some reflections from the group about parking generally, beyond what we talked about last time, in terms of, also thinking about those images and what the impact of parking is on site design and neighborhood impacts, and think about, what are some of the overall direction that you can provide us in terms of setting the parking minimums, considering on-street parking credits, and thinking about how that parking ultimately gets configured on the site.
And Elizabeth, I just want to jump in while people are thinking about what they want to say. We are almost to an hour. It's gone by in such a blink. We have 3 minutes left.
I thought we had till 7:30.
I think we are scheduled till 7. Doug, is that correct?
We had originally talked about an hour. Yes.
So we'd have to see if everybody's available to keep moving until 7:30. If not, we might want to figure out what we do.
Well, I could stay an extra half hour if others can.
General agreement.
Me too. Me too.
I can stay.
Oh,
Okay, great. And I'm hoping, Elizabeth, since we did get a chance to touch on parking last time, that maybe we do get a chance to get into those master plans. And I think you had a little more on cottage clusters to dive a little deeper. So maybe I'll just throw out that, maybe we keep the parking discussion sort of brief here. Yeah.
yeah, no, my apologies. I have a calendar error I can see right now that I put this on my calendar wrong. But all the pieces are coming back into play. I know that actually we talked about how are we going to get through all this in an hour? And thank you all for your flexibility. I am embarrassed to not have managed the time better. So, okay. Well, I guess, real quick, speak now or hold your comments about parking. But maybe we will instead, next slide, dive right into cottage clusters, and keep in mind that we have some parking issues there as well.
I have a solution for that parking. We need to build a big storage like in the airport. They have a big building. That's what we need to do here in Newburgh. That's fun.
So I just want to make sure, so we will talk about parking again at some point, right? Because there were people bringing up some concerns about that. And I think it would be good to flesh some of that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I would say if you have any, overall comments about parking right now, then let's share them. If not, let's talk about parking, we got some comments about parking with the specific housing types last time, and we can talk about it here with the cottage clusters, which, is a little different application. So what's the group preference?
I think as we think about parking, perhaps what needs to be brought to the discussion is if there's any research on how many cars are typical, say, for a family nowadays,
Mhm.
or for certain kinds of housing. For example, if we have somebody taking a 2-bedroom unit, does that mean usually there's going to be 2 cars? Is it going to be 1 car? You know, if we can get it found that find the information broken down by unit.
Yeah, we can certainly look into that. And I think I would just add, yes, we can look at that for existing and past uses. And then it'll sort of be up to the group to think about how we balance current demand versus future needs.
Mhm.
I don't
I-
remember right now where did I saw that, but I think it's two parkings per house. It should be 2 parkings per house. Single house family.
Yes, I believe that's the requirement right now. But
Yeah.
as we get into these middle housing types, that's going to come down to 1 parking unit per 1 parking space per unit, with an option to reduce it further if the city is interested in that.
Ouch. Okay, thank you.
So I think some of the links that you had sent within the memo actually had some interesting points that you'd sort of touched on a little bit, like the 85%, like if parking is occupied at 85% on the street, then that's considered like that's still pretty good. And so if you look at our neighborhoods around Newburgh, I'm like, I don't know of any that are at 85%. So we have this perception of parking being a problem, but is it really a problem? Can you find parking? There's like a perception issue there. And then also maybe bringing a little more, one of the other presentations had the parking unit by like every time you provide another parking spot, it is this much in value, or like it increases the value of the house, therefore decreasing affordability, like all of those costs that make housing more expensive for the buyer, so that, or the renter. And also, do we have neighborhoods in Newburgh that are considered, that have parking problems where it would border on needing like permits?
At this time, Melissa, no, we don't. I can say for the downtown area, we have done a parking utilization study when we did the downtown plan. And like what happens in many times in cities, we have a few blocks where we have some hot spots. And visually, we're seeing that we're getting more parking occurring down on 2nd Street, which is that transition area from the commercial to the residential. But then up just north of downtown, kind of between downtown and the railroad tracks, we get some comments on parking issues there, but some of that is related to the very narrow streets from curb to curb, and then student housing and students having parking. And so that's a little bit different dynamic. If you get north of the railroad tracks, since my time here, we haven't heard any issues about parking.
I live in the 3rd Street by Church Street, where it's Walgreens, and we do have a parking problem in this area just because of the students and because of the apartments are 3 bedrooms apartments. So there is a problem for parking in this area, but then you can go to the other street and there is nobody there and you can park there. So I don't know if that's really a problem or it's just, you just need to walk a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think it'll also be interesting to think about, are there neighborhoods that lend themselves to middle housing more, and does that result in more of these hotspots, or do they wind up being distributed to the degree that, it isn't really perceptible? So
yeah, it's hard to say.
Okay, Well, let's talk about cottage clusters, and we can think about, parking and some of the other issues that get into this. But, with some of those images in mind now of what a cottage might look like and what the cottage cluster layouts could look like, what we're hoping to do with this project is bring in a cottage cluster as an outright permitted use that someone could build on a single lot in the R1, R2, R3, and RP zones. These cottages, under state rules, have a maximum footprint of 900 square feet and an area, depending on whether you cap it at 1 story, 2 stories. There's a range of 900 to 1,800 square feet for the maximum area, and it can be set anywhere in that range if the city wants to set a standard. We're looking at clusters of at least 5 to 8, or up to a larger number of units, and that's where we get at sort of some of the overlap with the triplexes or quadplexes, and why this is set at 5. It sort of kicks in after that. Lot sizes, these can be on any lot 7,000 square feet or more with that common open space. And the minimum parking could be set at 1 space per unit, or of course the option to go lower. So next. So here's, a graphic from the state about some of the specifics of how these have to be laid out. In terms of having half of them face onto this courtyard and getting the parking away from the units. Okay, next. And then, just to repeat, some of these ones we were looking at, this layout would not meet the state requirements currently, but we have some flexibility about, if we change the percentage of units that have to be oriented to the common courtyard, if we want to allow additional flexibility, or if you think that courtyard feature really is central, literally and figuratively, to the concept, then we can retain it. Next. And again, here's, that other option we were looking at that has some different orientation. And then also the bigger piece here is that it does not have that detached parking area. It has these individual garages integrated into each of the courtyard. And we'd have to make some changes to the footprint standards. There's a little bit of flexibility if we're allowing some garages, whether those count or don't count towards the footprints. If you want to make this more of an option, we can look at ways to do that. Okay, next. So the discussion that we were hoping to get your input in is, is there a desired size of units that you'd like to see? Do you think it's important that the code caps the maximum size somewhere between 900 and 18 square feet, or leave it open? And if there's a number of units per cluster that you think is an important standard to set, whether it's important to allow, we've had a couple of questions about rental versus ownership. So whether we are going to look at adding a subdivision option that would allow individual fee simple lots for these so that it could be an owner product. That orientation question about whether and how many units have to be facing the green space. And then parking questions about both the number and whether to allow some flexibility with those garages or continue to require shared common parking areas as the model code lays out. Any thoughts about cottages?
Is there a requirement on how many units should be built for people who have accessibility issues, wheelchair access? So not just from outside, but also inside, that the unit is built with all those requirements, because these kind of houses may be popular for people who are in wheelchair or some other issues.
Mhm.
Would that be covered by the code too, or not necessary?
Yeah, that's a great point. It would not necessarily be covered by the code. If these were all built on a single lot and were rented out, more like, I don't know if they would fall under the ADA provisions for multifamily housing, where if you hit a certain number of units, you're required to have an ADA accessible unit. It really hasn't come up. Some cities have offered incentives, like you can get greater density of units or some other flexibility if you allow some that are ADA accessible inside. But I don't know what the status is of those. So we can look into it some more.
You ask how big the house or what we would like to see. If you asking to me in personal, I would like to see houses built that have 3 bathrooms or 4, 3 to 4 rooms, 1.5 or 2 bathrooms and 2 parkings for big families to be able to live together. If I have to answer that question, what type of houses I would like to see build, I would like to see houses like that, 4 to 3 rooms and 1 or 2 1.5 or 2 bathrooms and 2 parkings.
Yeah, and these ones were specifically talking about cottage clusters. And so they're sort of the premise of these ones is that we could trade off smaller size of units in order to have more units fit. Or, there could be more flexibility in the size of the units. And it's up to the builder if they want to do larger units, where you might not be able to fit as many, or if they want to do smaller ones. So, perhaps they're, one way to say is perhaps the city doesn't want to regulate the maximum size of units so that there's more flexibility to add some family size units. Or what's the, yeah,
got it.
Does that seem accurate? Having either no or a higher size of units allowed would be desired for more flexibility, or is there a desire to see these cottage units stay regulated at a smaller scale? Knowing this is just one of the many middle housing types we'll be adding to the city.
These can be 2 stories, right? They're not just 1 story. I just have that image in my mind for some reason of the 1-story cottage. So I have to keep forcing myself to think that it's not just that.
Yeah, I keep thinking of Friendsview would love something like this, right? I mean, this is a retirement community is what I have in my head for cottage clusters. I guess I haven't seen a way that like a neighborhood built in a cottage cluster, but I think it's kind of a cool idea.
Okay.
Well, this is Doug. Maybe I'll just kind of jump in here. From a market perspective, if you provide the flexibility, that gives the developer more options. And so if you went with, no greater than 900 square feet, but the building envelope could be up to 1,800 square feet, that gives them flexibility to build different sizes. So they could choose to do some at 900, they could choose to do some at 1,200 building envelope or 1,800. So let the market kind of respond to that. For the clusters, things I've looked at, 5 to 8 is pretty good. But I think for the committee, might you want to allow up to 10 cottages in a cluster or 12?
Yeah, 12 is a pretty common number.
And then for minimum lot size, 7,000 square feet, that's the minimum. If a developer walked in and found a 9,000 square foot lot and wanted to put in cottages and he had the flexibility on the building envelope size, then there's some different product that could actually go on the ground. the idea of common space, by requiring everything has to face onto the common area, has some limitations to it again. And so if you were considering having something that's more flexible, maybe you have some portion of a cottage cluster that has common space. Another portion is not required to have that common space. Again, providing that flexibility. And I think from the conversation we had 2 weeks ago on the parking component of that, my takeaway was, you know, everybody in those conversations was, we wanted at least one parking space on site. So that's just throwing that out for consideration.
So
What-
it also seems like then these would be either rentals or somehow it would be entry-level housing if you could make it condominium, or how would that work?
You could do condos, or if the city is interested, we can also pursue changes to the subdivision ordinance so that a developer could create individual fee simple lots for these cottages, and just sell them the same as any other home.
What is the usual requirement for the common space?
In terms of, well, stalling for time. It's 150 square feet per unit, and it has to be centrally located and meet some, minimum dimensions so that it isn't some wacky, sliver of land. And I believe the model code requires 50% of the units to be oriented onto that open space, which is a number that could go up or down.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misinterpreting it. So for every unit, roughly, we could say there's about 10 by 15 space.
Mhm.
So if I've got 5 units, that's about roughly a 50 by 75 foot space. I'm just doing this off the top of my head.
It's not that big.
Okay, let's see. All right, so a 750 square foot spot
Yeah.
for 5 units, I think is the number.
Yep.
Is that, as we think about livability in these cottages, is that really enough space for children to have a place to play? When I'm thinking about the common space and we're looking at families moving in here, even temporarily, can we write into the code what percentage we need for common space?
Isn't that similar to parking though? Like the more that you make required for something that's not a building, that's less area that you can have homes on.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess wow. A short answer to the question is, under the state model code and requirements, 150 is the max that can be required. So I'm not really sure I don't think we have the flexibility here to increase that.
Okay, so it's the max. Okay.
Yeah. But also this 150 square feet is how much needs to go in the common open courtyard. That's not to say that every other square foot of the site is going to be paved and covered with homes. There's still going to be some other, green spaces surrounding the individual units and, setbacks between them. So there could be more, green space throughout the site than just this common space. But that's the central clustered, hopefully more usable area.
Okay.
Okay, well, to be respectful of your additional time that you've already granted us, let's talk a little, next slide, about our master plan communities. And again, you know, Newburgh is unique in having much of its available buildable land, over 58% of the buildable land, is in these sub-districts and specific plan areas that have master plans that are eligible for some, you know, potentially different treatment under the zoning regulations for middle housing in terms of where, so duplexes have to be allowed on every lot in these areas, but the other middle housing types that we're talking about for the triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters, there's some more flexibility in terms of how they get integrated. So next slide. So just visual tour, Springbrook in the north. Next. The airport residential district. Next. Springbrook Oaks, which is kind of to the south and east of Springbrook, and Northwest Newburgh specific plan, you know, as the name says. And then the riverfront down in the south, right on the river. So those are the geographic areas, and because they have had some special planning for those districts, there is, you know, perhaps a case, there is certainly a case to be made from the state level and potentially at the local level about whether middle housing is integrated into these areas that have already been planned in a slightly different way. So next. So yes, like I was saying, duplexes have to be permitted on every lot, but there are options to tailor the allowances for other middle housing types, provided that some overall net density targets are met and that subsequent redevelopment of middle housing is permitted. So, you know, in however long, you know, if someone wanted to redevelop their brand new home, it probably won't be tomorrow, but further on down the line, if they wanted to expand it or put it in a new type of housing, that would have to be allowed. So next. So the real question here is, you know, I think, not to put words in your mouth, but when we were discussing whether these housing types should be treated differently in these master plan communities or permitted more broadly, similar to the residential zones, the initial direction I heard last week was that they should be, or not last week, 2 weeks ago, was to look at them more broadly. So that's certainly something we could do, but I'd be interested to get more feedback from you all about, you know, if that adequately captures what you're thinking, or if there are some of these areas that should be treated differently than others, or how you think, if you think a different approach is merited for these master plan communities.
I'm wondering, Doug, if you have some ideas on, are there specific like areas of these master planned areas? Because it's almost hard to answer without knowing or seeing like a larger picture of what is planned there, you know, so what their zoning or density already is. And so would it be more helpful to allow more housing types, or is it just going to make everything a mess? Like, it seems like an opportunity with so much land in there.
Yeah. So quickly walk through that. Springbrook Oaks is essentially built out. The last development for the residential side, we've done a land use approval. So Friends View is going to build Springbrook Communities Phase 2, which is going to be duplexes. And then the very last phase of that one would be about a 58 unit apartment building. So really not much in the way of impact there. If you go up to the Northwest Pacific plan, there's one large lot that's off of Aspen Way that goes back to the west to be developed in the future. And there's a couple of infill parcels, you know, maybe an acre in size or so. So that one is pretty well built out. Then if you get to the riverfront area, That one is, it's kind of a mix. There'll be some future multifamily, medium density, where, duplexes and or cottage clusters and so forth could occur. The airport district, again, that's another one that essentially for the residential portion of that, we've now built that one out. Then we get to Springbrook, and of course Springbrook, nothing has been developed yet, so that's the one that probably has more of an opportunity. We already know we're going to have to allow the duplexes. I think the question would be, with the 1,345 units that are planned in that development, could there be some triplexes and some quads or some cottage clusters or some townhomes? I think that's feasible to do. Again, the developers in the market will respond to that. So that's kind of a picture of where those opportunities are. Hopefully that helps, Melissa.
What would it look like to allow these? Like, how is it just writing it in a way that says this would be allowed in currently master planned communities?
Yeah, I mean, there's the current regulations for these areas are kind of a mix of like, here's some specific things to this area, and then in addition, you can do everything in the regular residential zones here. So yeah, there's sort of some technical aspects about how we would permit it, but say we rewrite the R1 and R2 and R3 zones to allow these whole middle housing types, we would probably just say for these master plan communities, like, you can develop similar to the R1, or with whatever other exceptions are or refinements are applicable to that master plan community. So.
And once we hit the 25,000 population mark, would all these other types then be rolled into the duplex allowability as well?
Great point. No, they would not. So that's really the distinction here, is that the other middle housing types can be treated differently, even for all communities over 25,000. So, and in fact, I mean, it was in part Wilsonville that made a big issue about that, like had a lot of questions about how their master planned areas would be treated. And so, really campaigned for this. And I guess I would say, getting the group's initial impressions is really useful. LCDC is still working on these sections, and it sounded like at their meeting last week, they were not able to reach a final decision. And so they asked staff to go back and take another look at it. So, some of the specifics could be changing by the time we come back to you, but it's interesting and useful for us to get a sense of the general direction that you'd like to go. Okay, but with, next slide, please. With, with 1 minute left. Some other issues, but next, these are more just sort of cleanup issues that we'll take care of. Next. Yes, Heather, I'm turning it over to you for your 1 minute in the spotlight.
My 1 minute in the spotlight. Okay, so we do have a public open house scheduled coming up next month, December 15th. We wanted to get your feedback, although we've left you no time to do it, on what we would be presenting during that meeting and what we should be focused on. So just having had 2 of these meetings though with this group, it's my impression that we should be showing those different housing types, really making sure we're clear on what middle housing is, what the different types of housing are, the duplex, triplex, quadplex, townhomes, and the cottage clusters. We know parking is an issue. We've heard it so many times. And so we want to make sure we're really clear about the state requirements, but then also make sure that we're taking, input on that as well. And like Elizabeth said, we could consider doing less than the state requirement. I haven't heard that from this group or from other looks into Newburgh stakeholder interviews and that sort of thing. So I think the parking discussion will probably be a lot of here's what we're required to do. So here's what that will look like. And then, you know, I had a note to ask, should we get into the master plan areas? But I guess that would be a question. So really quickly, thoughts on presenting to the public, housing types, parking, master plan areas, and then anything else that you think would be important. And you can always follow up. We always have a conduit via Doug that if something comes forward and you're like, that should really be on that agenda, let us know. Okay. Well, Elizabeth, do you have any final things that you need to touch on?
No, I just want to thank you all for your time and your continued time. We'll be integrating all of this and that open house feedback into a final draft of these code assessments and concepts. And then we'll be able to move into some of the draft code language in early next year. So we look forward to seeing you at the open house. And any help also that you can provide in helping us advertise would be really useful, or groups that you could connect us to. So hope to see you there and then in the new year. So thank you all for your help tonight.
Melissa, this is your opportunity to adjourn the meeting.
Okay, so do I ask for a motion or do I just adjourn?
You should actually ask for a motion and get a second to adjourn
Oh,
in a vote.
Okay, all right. So do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Robert makes a motion.
Do I have a second?
I second it. Leslie seconds
right.
it.
All right. We have a, oh, Doug, how do you say that? Meeting
You have
adjourned.
a motion. You have a motion in a second. You just call for the vote. All those in favor say aye.
All in favor, aye. Say aye. Yep.
Aye.
Aye. All right.
All those
Motion
opposed?
passes. None opposed.
All right. Thank you all. We hope to see you at the open house. We will be working to pull that together. And then our next meeting will be after the first of the year. So I will get an email out, make sure everybody's got it on their calendar. We went through that at the orientation session on our meeting date, but I will make sure I get another email out so you have dates on your calendar. So thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you all.